The Islamic State, ISIS, is known as a brutal terrorist organization. But how did it function on a daily basis? As a recent study revealed, ISIS was struggling to create a functioning bureaucracy inspired by normal states. To understand how bureaucracy coexisted with brutal terrorist regime, we have invited Daniel Milton, who is a professor of transnational security studies at the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, and before he was an associate professor at the United States Military Academy, West Point, with the focus on combating terrorism. Professor Milton's views are his own in this interview and do not represent the US government or any official institution. Welcome, Professor Milton.
Oh, thank you for making time and inviting me. It's a great opportunity to talk about interesting subjects.
I see that you have just arrived to Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Your office is absolutely empty. Thank you again that in this hectic and rush of the transfer from the American continent to Europe, you found time. And we have seen the development in the Middle East within the last 10 years with a lot of political changes having place there. And you have published your study on the ISIS and how the Islamic State functioned there and what challenges, if you can say, this terrorist organization had to control the territory. Now, ISIS is mostly defeated, not completely maybe, but there is no such threat anymore. Still, what lessons do we have from the creation and existence and spreading of such structure as ISIS?
You know, it's really interesting because the group itself has continued to refer to the period of time when it had established these structures as an example of what they can achieve. And so, as you rightly pointed out, even though they have been defeated territorially in many senses, they retain this vision and hope that they can do this again in the future. So I think studies like this are helpful to understand the roadmap, if you will, that some of these groups follow as they try to establish themselves as states, or at least as proto-states in different parts of the world. And so I really think that there, unfortunately, will still be some future use for this work. But I also think it's useful just from a historical perspective to understand what really was the goal of these groups and how they tried to implement it. Even if they weren't successful, I think there's a lot of value in understanding what they were able to achieve and some of the struggles that they saw along the way.
Indeed, but in your study you have published recently about how ISIS functioned, you point out that ISIS, while being a terrorist organization, faced the same problems like many standard normal states with their bureaucracy faced. And what I found absolutely fascinating in your study is that while ISIS message to the world that they are some sort of a absolutely new creation, quite different from any other bureaucratic structure, and the fact they not only had the same problems like many bureaucracies face, but they deliberately wanted to create a functioning bureaucracy, copy pasting some practices and ways of governing the territory and people who they controlled. How can you describe this?
I do really think that that is one of the things that is so interesting about this research is that you have a group that holds itself up as being totally different. And yet, when we get into the details of the paperwork that that group created, we actually see things that we would anticipate that we would find if we had to walk into a local city hall, or if we had to go down the street and perhaps purchase something at a store and there was a dispute between us and the store owner. We see all of the types of things that regular humans find in their interactions in their daily lives represented in this material, and ISIS trying to figure out how to handle it, how to manage it. And so I think that it suggests that even though they tried to portray an image of being so vastly different, and there certainly were differences between their worldview and their ideology, and we see that in these documents too. Ultimately, they struggled with the same things that most governments struggle with. And in some cases, those struggles seem to be even greater because they didn't really have the experience or the skill or the capability that others have established having done these things for a long time.
That was fascinating for me as I've been recently to Iraqi Kurdistan, the northern part of the country, pretty autonomous, one can say even independent. And we've been to Soleimania, a major city in the west of the country, in ISIS museum. And when you enter that museum, you see the whole like tables full with stamps which ISIS used for any purpose like tax office, vehicle registration office, office for issuing some papers. And they think, okay, it is what you can see in any city hall. But was it like a natural development for them? And how did it impact their capacities to expand their terrorist activities?
So I don't necessarily know that it was totally natural for them. One of the things that the group did in its early days was it called for people to come join the group who had skills in managing a city or in managing a particular entity or bureaucracy or whatever the case might be. And so I think they had to incorporate some of that. But then you also have to remember that one of the ways that they managed their caliphate was to use local individuals who had already been in some of these positions to keep working in those positions, even if they weren't formally members of the group. And so I think they had to blend kind of their lack of experience by importing it, and then by using some of the people who were there locally to try to develop these structures. But ultimately, one of the challenges that they faced is as they tried to expand this, they they didn't have enough skilled people. And I think you see that in some of these documents. They had to rely on people who had maybe come from abroad, who didn't have a detailed work history or background, and they had to put them in charge of a security unit, or they had to put them in charge of evaluating real estate claims. And you see that in the documents, sometimes they really struggled to figure out how to resolve them, particularly as people brought problems to them. And so the expansion that the group tried to do, I think, was just a little bit too much for the skill and capability that they actually had within the group.
And of course, like when you exist for several years and the territory which you control grows, and you have people who live there, who do their daily business, who grow food, who sell food, who provide some services, you need to govern it. You need to collect taxes. Of course, you can just rob these people, but somehow functioning taxation brings you just more stability, right? And that is what ISIS needed. That you write in your study that their attempt to imply some laws which they have invented was not homogeneous. That it was arbitrary. Was it something from the nature of ISIS, or did it have like other reasons? And how did it, once again, how did it impact the functioning of the fighting terrorist capacity of this organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they tried to have a standard or something that all of the different entities of the organization should adhere to. And you see that in some of the documents, that they would often be getting memos from higher up in the structure telling them, hey, you guys are doing things the wrong way. You've got to do it this way. But ultimately, as it got bigger and bigger, it was hard to maintain that with a kind of even feel across the entire kind of territory that the group controlled. And certain people would run their offices a different way, and certain people would want to emphasize maybe personal privilege over standardization, or looking out for friends more than looking out for the people. And so all of those things, I think, really impacted, at least internally in some of these documents, how people viewed the caliphate. We see some people kind of complaining about what they see as a different standard being set. There's one document in particular where an individual who was a foreign fighter complained that he was being treated worse than people who weren't even members of the group. And we don't know exactly why, but there's part of me that wonders if there was just an inability of perhaps some of the local leaders of the group to accept some of the foreigners, and some of those tensions then came into the governance. And ultimately, I think a lot of those things are part of the challenge that the group really just struggled to deal with. And it's important to remember that they're struggling to deal with this, not just in terms of, establishing the state, but they're under continuous counterterrorism pressure from outside forces. And so they don't really have a lot of time to get these things right, because they're also trying to, fight and maintain on the front lines. And I think it just proved to be too much for them in the end.
How can you compare the situation with these quasi state like structures of ISIS with other similar institutions like Taliban or Boko Haram or other terrorist groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things that would be really interesting to do, and use this research kind of as a baseline. As we learn about some of these other organizations around the world that are also trying to provide some sort of public service or good, we see them struggling with similar things. It turns out that being a state is not easy, and not a lot of places have the ability to do it well. And so that creates opportunities for these other groups to offer their alternative, right, to do their effort at being the state or being the kind of government. And I think that what we find in these documents is a recognition that that process is not going to be easy or smooth, or sometimes even very good. And so I think as we look at other examples around the world, we should anticipate that we would find similar tensions as we found in this study. We should anticipate that they are struggling to balance the concerns of locals with the concerns of members of the organization. We should expect that they are trying on some level to provide some kind of public stability, but really struggling to figure out how to do that when the public continues to have kind of challenges with the way that the group wants to do things. And so I think we see elements of that as we look in Afghanistan or across different parts of Africa, where some of these other groups are trying to implement their vision. But I do think that what we found here is not completely unique in that sense. And I do think it probably has lessons for some of those other places as well.
That, I think, could be a sort of a bad disappointment for many fighters who came to fight for ISIS from across the world. We know there were people, even from such distant areas like New Zealand. I think like there were like a couple of fighters who came from New Zealand to fight for the ISIS. The ISIS has advertised itself as an institution where you can unlimitedly kill, torture people, to record it on GoPro cam, and to leave what you think is to be this violent way of creating a caliphate. But these people, when they came, they realized that it's not that easy. You cannot only fight all the way and execute people. You need to have economy structure behind that. And it can sound a bit like cynical and crazy, but even terrorism needs strong economic background and fundament and organization which stays behind it. What does it say for us? How can we combat terrorism?
Yeah, I think that it's important for us to learn the lesson about highlighting these things a lot sooner. I'm so grateful that we were able to do this research when we did it, but I also wish that we'd been able to do some of this research, 5 years ago or 8 or 9 years ago, right in the middle of all of the challenges that we were experiencing, as you pointed out, as ISIS is going out there and trying to attract people to the organization and saying, hey, we're going to establish this great state. It's going to be good. They would put in some of their propaganda, peaceful streets, carnivals, like things happening. I think it would have been useful to try to put this information out sooner. And I think that that's a lesson that we can take, is that as we're trying to engage against both terrorist organizations, and frankly, even if we think about other actors that we're competing with, maybe that are states, I think it's important to highlight the deficiencies and to not always hold on to them until 5 or 10 years later, when somebody's doing a retrospective study. I think it's important to recognize that there are challenges in governance for all of these organizations. And if we have information like these documents, it's really useful to allow them to be out there to give a little bit of a truer picture than these groups do in their propaganda. Because in the propaganda, it's all good. You can come out, you can fight, you can live on the home front, and it'll all be great. But what we see in these documents is that that's not always the case.
And many people think that it's like thinking about the war, that war is about shooting, throwing grenades, digging trenches. But in the fact, any war is, first of all, bureaucracy and economy and logistics.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that's actually one of the exciting things about this study and the way that we conducted it is not only did we put the study out there, but you can actually go look at the documents yourself. So all of the documents, 396 of them, are available in both Arabic and English at the website of the Combating Terrorism Center at ctc.westpoint.edu. And so if people aren't familiar with it, they can go look at the material themselves. They can read through and they can see for themselves that there is this different side to just the fighting, right? And so I will hope that people will take advantage of the chance to go look at those if they're interested.
What was the most strange, like unexpected document you have read?
So there was a document in there where an individual had brought their father to a hospital. He was in a very sick condition, and unfortunately, he passed away. And the individual was very concerned about being able to get his body where it needed to be so that he could do the proper burial. And so he talked to the local hospital administrator, and they promised him that they would keep his body in the morgue, in the freezer, until such time as an arrangement could be made. But it seems like the administrator was not being totally truthful, or that he had something against the individual's father, because when the individual returned, he found that his father's body had been thrown out in the trash. And so the individual then got really upset, and so he filed a complaint. And so what's interesting in this document, in addition to the terrible kind of content itself, is you can actually see the ISIS bureaucracy responding and saying, can this even be true? This is such a terrible thing. How did we do this? And so you actually see some handwritten notes from people saying, I can't believe that our administrator got it this wrong, or something like that. And so again, it's one of the extreme cases from the material, but it's really an interesting insight into some of the struggles that they faced.
Wow, that is like an ISIS bureaucrat in a healthcare office was shocked by the brutality of his subordinate. That is something like you just should imagine, like reading these documents. Indeed, bureaucratic documents are a source of endless discoveries.
Absolutely. There's a lot of stories in there. So some of them haven't been told yet, and I hope people will look at them.
How much of potential of a sort of recognition or at least tolerance towards the ISIS did this bureaucracy have? We know that now, like, ISIS is mostly defeated, and there is no such question anymore. Will ISIS be recognized somehow, like Taliban, for example, has been recognized? But still, if you have a terrorist group which is in the first years, which is absolutely being rejected by the international community, and the international community tries to fight it, but then within this group, quasi-state-like structures arise, and maybe in 10 years, if it survives, someone comes to a deal. Okay, maybe they're not bad after all. The bad years are already behind. We need to deal with them, and then, if not diplomatic, but first trade relations, and then, of course, diplomatic relations take place. How much of danger do these tendencies of creating state-like structures have for the world?
Oh, I think that's a really interesting question. And frankly, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of pressure that ISIS kind of was under, and I think that's part of the reason why its governance experiment failed. If we go back to a world, right, a counterfactual where that doesn't happen, even though we see a lot of these challenges in these documents as ISIS was trying to do governance, I don't necessarily know that it would have failed on its own accord. The mere fact that they had this system in place suggests that they were trying very hard to establish this. And ultimately, would they have been successful absent the counterterrorism pressure? I don't know that they ever would have established a wonderful, thriving community or state, but I do think that they could have stayed in power much longer absent that pressure. And what would have happened then? Would people have been inclined to recognize them? Those are all questions that are interesting to think about, but I would have to be perfectly honest. I don't know. And of course, my hope would be no, because ultimately the ideology of the group is one that that has a lot of things about it that I think are undesirable. And ultimately, it would have been a challenge to see that contained to any region. The group itself wanted to expand as far as it could. And I don't think that that would have gone away, even if they were able to establish, in one locality, some governance or some statehood. And so I think it probably would have not ended well.
Well, we know that there were like such experiments. Like one is the most recent with the Taliban, which was first defeated and then regained its strength, and now is practically de facto recognized by the world. Like we from Germany, we deport those people who have been rejected asylum. We deport them back to Afghanistan. That is practically the recognition of the Taliban as the governing force. And another example, which strikes me personally, as I'm a person who was born in the Soviet Union, is the Soviet Russia. The Soviet Russia was totally rejected in 1917, 1920 with foreign intervention against the Soviet regime, which looked to be absolutely brutal and which was absolutely brutal and which was destroying cultural values, executing people, rejecting the international world order. And in 1922, up to 1922, it was already recognized by some states, and then in 30s, it was already recognized by the whole world. So there is some potential of these structures, despite they being disgusting and being rejected in the early years, that if they survive, they continue their operation. Where was the breaking point in ISIS, despite the fact that the international pressure was, besides the fact that the international pressure was so strong and, after all, effective?
I mean, I think that was the key. Honestly, if there had not been that international pressure, I don't know that it would have collapsed under its own weight. Some people argued that it would have. Some scholars have said, hey, their system was doomed from the beginning. But because of the examples, some of which you've cited, I don't necessarily know that would have been the case. And so I really do think it was that international coalition and their willingness to continue to keep on the group that prevented that possible future from emerging. And I think that that's also something that, I revisit even in our time today. I do think that ISIS has continued to exist, even though it is not what it used to be. And I worry that if we take the pressure off too soon or too much, that will allow for that future to perhaps reemerge. The group still believes in it. The group still thinks that's a possibility. And so I think it continues to be important for us to be vigilant as an international community and to try to avoid a future that, even though it may have happened before, we certainly don't want it to happen too many times again.
Indeed, and as I've been last week to Kurdistan, close to Mosul, I was told by the locals that ISIS is like cancer. You can say you have defeated cancer, but still you need to treat your body regularly for a longer time after that and get checked regularly to be sure that it has not reappeared again. And that is the lesson for us all. We cannot just relax and say, okay, job is done and nothing bad will happen, because bad can happen again, and it's much more dangerous than we used to think. Thank you, Professor Milton. It was an interview with a professor of international security studies at the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, Daniel Milton, who is an expert in combating terrorism and who has authored his study on how bureaucratic structures within ISIS functioned and how ISIS tried to create a real functioning state out of the vague and not pretty much integrated terrorist cells. Thank you, Professor Milton.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you again, and don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss interviews like this.